Now, as to me saying what I believe the third heaven to be, I will only say that I see it as a spirit realm, a spiritual realm, which has nothing to do with the natural universe at all, not even touching it. But I won't really say herein what my views on it are, for I will be dedicating an entire book toward it in the near future called St. Paul in Arabia and of his travels to the third heaven. And I'm not trying to do a hit and run here and try to confuse everybody. It's that this book had already swollen to over 400 pages, and to get into that subject, it's going to take a lot. So that's why I have a whole book dedicated toward that. However, I do say somewhat on it in a book I'm working on right now about Adam and Eve being in a metaphorical garden. And I may have said something on it in the Godhead book. So I do throw out a lot of hints in several of my other books. So anyways, well, what I just said here, though later on in this book, I will actually throw some more hints toward the reader as to how I see the third heaven when I will speak more on the heavens. Okay, so maybe I'll say more about it here. So anyways, let's hit our first subnote called celestial. If you remember, I talked about celestial, that I would speak about it a little bit more. I wanted to point out that in our dictionary meaning, we don't have to imagine that heaven only means a city up in the sky somewhere. Like I said, heaven no doubt has certainly come to be known as a wonderful city in the clouds or the cosmos, for that's what many folks believe. But our word celestial, which is one of the definitions of that Strong's quote that I did for Esperanto, for heaven, our word celestial, which is one of the definitions, can denote things that are just heavenly or simply wonderful without having anything to do with a city at all. But, of course, this Greek word does have to do with God's kingdom in general and should denote anything that his hands touch and blesses. Things, that are heavenly. Okay, and our next subnote is about the words in italics, which were placed in by the King James Version translators for ease of sentence flow. This is actually a well-known fact among scholars and can be seen as a reality by even a simple online search. However, opinions vary tremendously about why the translators decided to do it. So if you're just wanting a simple fact expressed without massive opinions about it, then you need not look any further than Cambridge's website fact section on the Bible at cambridge.org. And I put that up here on the screen so you can see the address for that. Be careful, though, of what opinions that you do read online concerning the subject. Well, be careful about anything that you read online, for that matter. For some people, some of those folks highly praise what the translators had done, going as far as to say that the italicized words should now be counted as actual scripture. Some of those folks completely condemn the translators for it, saying that the italic words shouldn't be there at all. As I've expressed several times before, even in other books in this teaching series, my own personal opinion is that at various times these italics both help and hinder the reader to or from fuller understandings, actually helping much more than hindering. But also that they should never be counted as actual scripture. Why? Simply because the translators were not the original authors of the text. They were, again, translators, trying to help the rest of us to understand the original words in a single language. However, again, and as I've expressed in other books in this teaching series, God did indeed have the translators do the italics for various reasons, to both help us in our vernacular understandings, but to also to obscure the pure truth away from those who only wish to use the Bible for self-gain. Is this getting complicated? It's not when we understand. This is not complicated when we understand that God wrote the Bible through the hands of the original authors to only his true children, and not to all the occupants of the entire world, especially not to Pharisaic natured and minded men like those false ministers of Jesus' day. Therefore, only God's actual children will truly understand what their Lord is saying within, and they will ignore what man has to say. Let's go to John 4 through 5. This is Jesus talking, and I have another subnote for this. When Jesus put forth his own sheep, he goes before them, and the sheep will follow him. They're going to follow Jesus, for they know his voice. And a stranger they will not follow, but will flee from him, for they know not the voice of strangers. In Matthew 24:24, Jesus speaking again, there shall arise false Christs and false prophets, and shall show great signs and wonders, insomuch that if it were possible, they shall deceive the very elect, i.e., it's not possible to fool God's actual children. But even so, the case, that is, that God ordained the italicized words to be in the Bible for both good and decoying purposes. Am I going to get further into this explanation? Yeah. And I'm going to explain my position just a little further down, and I'm going to justify what I'm saying, so stay tuned. That is, that the italics are for both good and decoying purposes. I will get to why I'm saying that. One still cannot say that the italicized words are actual scripture. Only what the original authors had written down to begin with should be considered actual scripture. In fact, I could go as far as to say that even though I believe God ordained those italicized words, for the reasons that I just expressed, that we still don't actually have to have them, and can, if need be, simply ignore them when clear understandings come to us of what the original authors were meaning. Because, once again, the italicized words were not in the original autographs, i.e., the original text, and should therefore only be considered crutches to help us understand the original thoughts. But seeing as a few of them, and just a few, can hinder our full understanding, I got a sub-note coming up for that explanation that I promised to speak on. That alone should prove that they are not canon. But again, God really did oversee and had orchestrated the construction of the King James Bible, as I'm going to thoroughly express in my upcoming book called The Bible is Not a Buffet, and as I had briefly went over in short detail about in my already published book, In the Beginning It Was Spiritual from the Very Start. However, and even though expressed by my words, that is, that God indeed ordained the King James Version, that does not mean that I am a King James Version only person, as I will also speak on therein. Now, let's go to our third subnote called St. John 10:4 through 5 and Matthew 24:24. Let me quote those again real quick so it'll be fresh on your mind of why I'm talking about those two. First, John 10:4 through 5. And when Jesus puts forth his own sheep, he goes before them, and the sheep follow him. They will follow Jesus, for they know his voice, and a stranger will they not follow, but will flee away from him, for they know not the voice of strangers. Matthew 24:24, there shall arise false Christs, false prophets, shall show great signs and wonders, insomuch that, if it were possible, they shall deceive the very elect, i.e., it's not possible to fool God's true children. I don't want to be misunderstood of why I chose those two scriptures to quote at that particular time. My meaning is not for the reader to think that I believe the added in words, the italicized words of the King James Version Bible, or of any other translation for that matter, are just as bad as the words of a false teacher. No. My meaning was simply to say that even if the added in words might throw a person off, God's true children won't be deceived by them, even if they don't completely understand what they're reading at first. But even so, is it really possible to be thrown off of a true thought with those italicized words? Case in point, of which I had thoroughly went over in my book, In the Beginning It Was Spiritual from the Very Start, are the scriptures in the Gospel of John, chapter 18, verses 3 through 6, where the religious leaders of that day were coming to arrest Jesus, and he simply asked them whom they sought. They answered, Jesus of Nazareth, to which he replied, I am he. So as one can see, the word he in the actual scripture, in the King James Version, is in italics. The word he is in italics when he says, I am he, insinuating that the word was not in the original letter by John. Now let's go over John 18, 3 through 6. Judas then, having received a band of men and officers from the chief priests and Pharisees, comes there with lanterns and torches and weapons. Jesus therefore, knowing all things that should come upon him, he went forth and said unto them, Whom seek you? They answered him, Jesus of Nazareth. And Jesus said unto them, I am he. But of course, here on the screen in the program that I use to make these videos, I can't italicize the word on the screen. So when I quote scripture doing these videos, you can't see any of the words italicized, but if they affect the text, in my opinion, I emphasize it like I'm doing right now. So that word he right there should be in italics. But let's continue. Judas also, which betrayed him, stood with them. As soon then as he said unto them, I am he, they all went backward, and they fell to the ground. Now, if we were to remove the word he in this instance, then we'll have a greater understanding of why all those men fell backward to the ground when he said it. For what he had claimed with that one statement, that he was the great I am of the Old Testament, especially from Exodus. Let's go to Exodus 3:14. God said to Moses, I am that I am. And he said, Thus shalt thou say to the children of Israel, I am has sent me unto you. What I'm trying to say is, in the Garden of Gethsemane, when he said, Whom seek you? And they said, Jesus of Nazareth, he didn't say, I am he. He said, I am. Explaining why they fell backward to the ground with such power. We see this in John 8:57 through 58 as well. Then said the Jews to him, You're not yet 50 years old. Have you seen Abraham? Jesus said to them, Verily, verily, I say unto you, before Abraham was, I am. They got it right on this one. They didn't add in the word he. Is that even important to point out? Certainly is, for it tells us of the pre-existence of Jesus prior to his natural birth on earth. But with a reply like, I am he, that is, leaving in and considering the added word, we get the impression that he made a simple statement like, yeah, I'm the guy you're looking for. I'm the one. But anyway, I'm not trying to point out any wickedness or evilness on the part of the translators because of their intrusive words that they added. For again, I believe that God had a firm hand in the KJV's construction, even with its added in italicized words. Because you remember earlier we talked about heavenly places and that word places being italicized, and they did it right at that time instead of just saying heavenly. And that the translators felt confident in what they had done.